Today, protect your finances. One question you must ask your candidates. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, where I've noticed posts covering finance and prop news with a distinctively Australian flavour. I'm joined today by Robbie from the Citizens Party. Hi Robbie, how are you doing?
Good, Martin. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good. So in the pre-campaign this is a really important conversation because there is a question which everybody should be throwing at their prospective candidates.
Let's put the question up first and then explain why. The question is, will you, the candidate, commit to cleaning up ASIC, the regulator, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, and to paying restitution for its failures? That's the question. Because if you have not been a financial victim in Australia, wait a while. The way ASIC regulates the Australian financial system, there's a very good chance you will be. And we need to change the consensus in this country to one of this system must change. That's the question we're encouraging everybody to ask all the candidates in this election. Let's get a new consensus here.
Yeah, and that's really, really important, right? All sorts of reasons. The first is, of course, it's very interesting. If you look statistically at how many complaints that are actually passed to ASIC get any action at all, it's extremely limited and extremely small. But as also we've argued on previous shows, the whole way this is set up, it's actually designed to protect the large financial institutions, not those investors who are frankly very reliant on the assumption that the financial system is being policed. Well, it isn't, unfortunately.
No, it isn't. And you look at, it's 1% of complaints to ASIC get addressed, Martin. And then the way they're addressed, the success rate's even lower. 1% get investigated. And in terms of enforcement, what do you have to do to go to jail in this country if you're a white collar criminal? What do you have to do? I was talking to a financial victim last night who told me the story of the con man who ripped off him and his fellow victims in the Trio Capital collapse for more than $50 million. He got a few months at a facility in Cooma where he got to spend weekends at the beach, and he contrasted it to news from the United States that he was sharing where a financial fraudster had just been jailed for 660 years for what he did to financial victims in the United States. And when the financial fraudster said to the judge, "Your Honor, how am I supposed to serve this?" the judge said, "Do your best." There's a different culture in Australia. A former ASIC chairman admitted in his own words, he said, Australia is a paradise for white collar criminals. This is why. And if you don't enforce the law, if you don't send people to jail, if there is no fear of the regulator, and if there's no fear of the regulator, then ASIC can have the biggest staff of a regulator in the world, which it doesn't have, by the way, but ASIC could have the biggest staff of a regulator in the world. They still wouldn't be able to police everything that goes on out there. Right, and this is a failing that has been deliberately imposed upon ASIC. It reflects the philosophy of the government, captured in the term "buyer beware." Let the buyer beware. A caveat emptor, and by its own admission, ASIC said that's based on the efficient markets hypothesis, which is the idea that the market is self-correcting and is therefore always right. And if there is a bad apple, the market will detect it, and you, the consumer, will somehow automatically know that, maybe like the 100 monkeys theory, somehow that it's transmitted through the ether to you, and you absorb it subconsciously or somehow, and you'll know to avoid that kind of issue. And it's just not true. It doesn't happen in the real world. Most investors, especially in our country, Martin, where in the space of a couple of decades, we've gone from being a productive economy where people could retire after having worked in a productive industry their whole life. They could retire owning their own home on a pension with a few savings, and that's adequate for their retirement. We've gone from that to a financialized economy where everyone depends on these investments that they've been forced to adopt through the superannuation system, right? And we're all exposed to the markets and we're all exposed to investment schemes now, right? Because of this financialized economy. But people's education has not kept up with that. There's a sea of unsophisticated investors out there. Most people are unsophisticated investors. And for financial fraudsters, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. And there is no regulatory structure in place to proactively protect those consumers. None. People assume ASIC does it. And when it happens to them and they ask ASIC how it could happen, they discover bitterly that this is the system. It wasn't there in the first place. And that's what's got to change, because this is a after decades of sweeping this under the carpet, there is hundreds of thousands of financial victims and tens of billions of dollars of losses under that carpet. It's a great big lump. It's an elephant in the room.
Well, the point is nobody knows how big the elephant is, right? Because a lot of people just throw their hands up in horror and just give up. And, the chances are that if you haven't been tricked yet, you will be tricked at some point. And, of course, all these crypto scams and everything else that are now going on, just another, angle of attack from those who are scammers. The regulator has no real interest in making the market safe and secure, which is what people assume they're doing. As you say, it's all down to, well, if you want to go and invest, feel free. It's your money. If you risk losing it, then that's up to you. And they've sort of created this quasi sort of separation between sophisticated investors and other investors. But actually, even other investors, there is no real protection there. It is a shocking situation. And of course, we know specific cases like Sterling First, for example, where effectively this has all come unglued. And even now, investors are still struggling.
Well, let's update people on Sterling First, Martin, because you and I did a show at the beginning of last week, and it was very effective because we invited the viewers to participate in our campaign of phone calls into Parliament to get the government and the Labor Party to commit to compensating these victims before the election. Well, commit before the election to compensating these victims, right? And we did it last week because it was the last sitting week of Parliament before the election. Now, a flood of calls went in, and they were quite effective. And what happens is within a few hours, the receptionist picking up the phones in those politicians' offices know what these calls are about. Now, the consistently best response from those calls came from Labor Party politicians. The government doesn't want to have a bar of it. And, no surprise, give up on them, right? And in fact, I encourage people, if you want to, if you were the last person in Australia to have any doubts about the quality of Scott Morrison, look at the latest Liberal MP, Catherine Cusack's denunciation of him. And she's a federal MP from the Northern Rivers in northern New South Wales. Her denunciation of him for deliberately politicising the financial help for the victims of those floods, right? Where people who didn't serve were not likely to vote for the Labor Party because they were in those electorates were deliberately excluded. That's what she has said, right? This is a government without a soul, without a purpose, and they can go. Morrison said about Christine Hassan, Holgate, she can go. Well, he can go, right? Let's get rid of him. But what does the Labor Party have to offer? And while they were receptive to the calls, the Shadow Financial Services Minister, Stephen Jones, has actually shown his true hand. Now, the result of those calls from last week is at the end of the week of calls, Stephen Jones announced that he would be visiting the Sterling First victims in Mandurah in Western Australia. And that visit happened on Monday. There was a meeting over there a few days ago, 2 days ago, on Monday, between the victims and Stephen Jones. Everybody thought, well, if a shadow minister is coming over before an election to hold a meeting with these victims with the local candidate for the seat, he must have an announcement. Surely he wouldn't turn up empty-handed, but he did. And this is where it gets disgusting. And this is what I'm denouncing what Stephen Jones has done. Because the thing with Labor is, when it comes to these issues, they have a choice. They either say, do we commit to doing the right thing and fixing a problem, or do we just commit to doing something slightly more or slightly better than the Liberal Party? That's the political choice they make, right? And what do they end up choosing? We will commit to doing something slightly more and slightly better than the Liberal Party. It's not about solving the problem, it's appearances, because the attitude becomes quite cynical. Who are they going to vote for anyway? If we offer them just slightly more, slightly better, they have to vote for us because the other guys aren't going to give them anything. And this is a disgusting attitude. We need people in government who want to solve problems, because the problems are there to be solved. And you know, I've grown up, one of my sort of earliest awakenings when it came to politics as a teenager was I'd hear these politicians say, we're the ones who take the hard decisions, right? And when they said that, they're always talking about, the hard decisions were the decisions that crushed people, the decisions that sacrificed whole industries for a free trade deal. We're taking the hard decisions because there's this supposedly better option here. And, you know, that's a strong leadership, taking these hard decisions. Well, in the case of the decision we're talking about, this is a hard decision, but only if you're in the pockets of the banks, only if you're in the pockets of big finance. And they never seem to take those decisions. As someone pointed out when the Royal Commission was on, with all the revelations coming out every day about what the banks were up to. And the banks, of course, are using excuses, and every second excuse was it was a mistake. And someone said, how come the mistakes are always in the bank's favour, right? Well, the hard decisions politicians take always seem to be in the bank's favour, because they should be looking at this, you know, 50 to 100 billion pile of financial losses and saying, we've got to clean that up. What do we have to do to change the system? And they're refusing to do that. They will not commit to do that. And what Stephen Jones said, and I want to take to task what he actually said in this meeting, which was unconscionable, is he said that you've got to stick with us, because we, the Labor Party, will expand the scheme that the government has established called the Compensation Scheme of Last Resort. But he also admitted that Labor was prepared to support the government's version of it, which is a version that completely flies in the face of what the Royal Commissioner said should happen. The Royal Commissioner, Kenneth Haynes, said there should be a compensation scheme of last resort. It should deal with all financial victims since 2008, and it shouldn't be capped at a certain amount of money. Frydenberg put up a scheme that excludes most classes of financial victims, including victims in managed investment schemes, and it's capped to some pathetic amount of money of $150,000 or something, right? Whereas the average financial victim has lost, you know, $500,000 plus by now, unfortunately, in these schemes. So it was a deliberately cynical ploy by Frydenberg to look like he's doing something without doing anything really. Labor officially opposes that. Yet Stephen Jones said in this meeting on Monday that Labor is going to support that version of the bill when it's introduced, just to get something on the books. And then he said it'll take a year before we can actually get the scheme working to provide compensation. But in truth, it'll take probably longer than that if they actually get around to bothering to amend it. Rather than changing the bill before it's introduced, so it's introduced properly the first time, it'll take longer before they get around to amending it and drag out the problem, the process even longer for these poor victims. And then he said, and when it is set up, we'll put you, the victims, to the front of the queue. And the problem with that is that's a promise you can make without any accountability for delivery. Because even if Labor did do that, even if Labor did set up the CSLR, even if Labor did get around to expanding it so it includes victims that can include Sterling First victims, even if Labor did all those things and then put them at the front of the queue, supposedly, even if Labor did all that, the decision that the decision maker for the CSLR is not the government. It's this organisation called the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. And they could easily just shoot down, I'm going to give you some facts about them in a minute. They could easily just shoot down the whole thing. And the government said, oh, well, we did what we said we would do, but the victims are still left without money. Here's what you need to know about the Financial Complaints Authority. We wrote a flyer that victims were handing out at the Stephen Jones event, just to make the point that the CSLR proposal does not cover these victims. The flyer was called "Will a Labor Government Leave Elderly Australians Behind?" And we took Anthony Albanese's quotes from his budget and reply speech last Thursday, because he talked about the aged care crisis, right? And he said, he promised that if he is elected, his government will not leave Australians behind. Labor's plan for aged care, just bear with me, Martin, I'm going to need aged care soon. I'm in denial about how often I need my glasses. Okay. Labor's plan for aged care recognises the importance of, quote, security, dignity, quality and humanity in caring for elderly Australians. Mr. Albanese stated that, quote, our older Australians aren't just a number. They aren't a burden. They are people who deserve respect, courtesy, and the best possible attention. And essentially, we're not going to leave them behind. And we point out, neglect of our elderly is not just confined to aged care facilities. For decades, elderly Australians, such as the Sterling First victims, have been systematically targeted for exploitation by financial predators. And that's what we're dealing with here. It's bad enough, the nature of the financial system we described at the beginning, but different people do have different levels of sophistication. Unfortunately, elderly people are a particularly vulnerable class of investor, and they're particularly targeted because, of course, through no fault of their own, they tend to have assets like property that have increased in value thanks to the property bubble, right? And they're targeted for takedown. But if these victims are put at the mercy of the CSLR, which is the financial, and the decision maker is the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, listen to this list of how the Australian Financial Complaints Authority actually operates. And I credit one of our writers and researchers, Melissa Harrison, who wrote this up. She's done some really excellent research work on this subject. The Australian Financial Complaints Authority, AFCA, is funded by the financial industry. Many of its decision makers are ex-industry. I did an interview with a bank victim last year, Wayne Ditchburn. You can watch it on the Citizens Party's YouTube channel, who's a screen printer in Cooma. Wayne had this massive fight with his bank for years and years and years, and only through sheer tenacity was he able to eventually force them into doing something half right, not fully right, but half right. And then that was settled. He got a form of a payout in 2017. After AFCA was set up in 2018, he went back and to try and resolve the rest of his case in 2019. And when he called AFCA up, the person who answered his call was one of the main people from his bank that he used to have to fight with for years, who was stopping him getting any kind of justice when he was at that bank. That person had moved on to AFCA, right? So, I mean, it's one of those things that, you know, it's everything's rigged in the financial sector's favour. AFCA is a private company, not a government department or regulator. It does not have parliamentary oversight. It does not have to appear before Senate estimates. It is not subject to freedom of information laws. The Administrative Appeals Tribunal does not have jurisdiction to review AFCA decisions. All AFCA employees are immune from any liability. It is highly resistant to oversight of the merits of its decision-making. AFCA has kept its internal reviews secret. AFCA's decision makers are largely unaccountable. It is not a genuine avenue for a complainant to access true justice. AFCA operates extrajudicially outside the court system. Complainants do not receive the same legal protections which are afforded by the courts. AFCA is not bound by the rules of evidence and does not determine the legal rights of the parties to a complaint. And it does not permit appeal of its decisions. If the complainant is not satisfied with AFCA's decision, too bad. it is not possible to appeal an AFCA determination except through the courts. And that's what Stephen Jones said to these victims. Essentially what he did on Monday is he told the victims what Labor has told them for 2 years. He didn't have anything new. And in emphasising the CSLR, even though he's actually watered down Labor's promise now to expand it, because the first time I heard what he'd said on Monday, it was the first time I heard Labor saying that they were actually prepared to support Frydenberg's version of the bill with this vague promise that they'll change it once it's in, right? They're going to support a watered down version. They will supposedly fix it up. And even then, if they do all that, that organisation, AFCA, is in charge of making the decisions. And this told me, Martin, that we have a big problem. One of the victims said to him, listen, we've heard all this before. Will you commit to paying the $18 million we need in compensation to save our homes? And Stephen Jones said, in a very abrupt way, no. He didn't say, sorry, no. He didn't say, no, listen, I can't do that yet or whatever. He said, no. And then he said, no candidate or political party can promise you that. And that is not true. That is absolutely not true. The government of the day can commit to compensating these kinds of victims under these circumstances. They absolutely can commit to do that. They can commit to doing it through an act of grace payment from the Finance Department, which has no strings attached. They don't even have to admit legal liability to the victim so there's any kind of follow-on. They don't have to do that. They can just make the payment. But politically, in doing so, they will be acknowledging ASIC's failings. And that's the hang-up. That's what they refuse to do. They refuse to acknowledge them and accept responsibility for them. Because ASIC's failings are the failings of an agency, but the federal government is the responsible entity for that agency. And they do not want to set that precedent. Why? Because there's not just 120 or 130 Sterling First victims out there, Martin, as you know, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them. And both political parties want to sweep it under the carpet and pretend it didn't happen, right? And promise, post-Royal Commission will be better going forward. If they're not prepared to compensate victims and actually own up to that through that concrete action, you can have no confidence that they're committed to cleaning up the system going forward. And Labor showed it is just as weak on that as the government is. And the reason why is both of them are scared of the big end of town. Both of them are scared of the big banks, the big financial invested interests, who are the people who this dysfunctional regulatory system benefits, right? And they are scared of going into a war, a political war with those. This is not what the Labor Party used to be. I've got I'll just hold that up. That is Dr. Jim Cairns' book, Oil in Troubled Waters. I wrote an article on the back page of our alert service last week about some interesting chapter of Australian history in the 1970s. Dr. Jim Cairns was one of the most slandered people in the world in Australian history. But older people recognise the name. But when he represented a time when the Labor Party actually did go to war with big finance. They did take them on. And the consensus now in the Labor Party is they suffered for it. They were shot down for it. They lost government over it because, this is a very, very powerful vested interest, and that's what they're scared of. Well, that's not good enough. The Australian people are now the ones suffering. Who cares what the electoral fortunes of the Labor Party is? It's the Australian people who are the ones who are suffering. And if Labor actually took this issue up now properly, I think they would find there's a lot more support out there than they've ever had before, because there's such a big problem with financial victims. It's a huge problem, right? And Labor has to be prepared to take this up. So if they're not going to do it, be internally driven, Joe Public's going to have to do it for them by putting them all on the spot. And that's why that's why we're telling people to ask this question. Will you commit to cleaning up ASIC and to paying restitutions for the victims of its failures? We need to get out there and ask that question to every candidate and make this the subject again, just like it was before the Royal Commission, but this time make it work.
Yeah, absolutely, Robbie. And a couple of observations, right? There is deliberately no light between the government and the opposition on the financial sector, right? They are dancing the same tune, and people need to ask that question, why? And, some of it could be that because people are frightened of that sector, but also they don't want to be, I think, split apart, right? Because you could argue that 3 years ago, or whenever it was last time they came, the policies were actually quite a lot stronger, and unfortunately they got sort of separated. So the small target and the influence of the finance sector is why they're doing what they're doing. But it's not acceptable because it actually doesn't provide the support that's required. As we say, the problem is that ASIC itself is not an effective regulatory body. It is not looking after the interest of Australians and their savings. That's what we need. The other point about the AFCA, though, of course, is that they can't actually stand back and go above a specific case. So, for example, they might deal with, a particular problem with a particular, compensation to a limited extent. But there is no capacity in that organisation to stand back and say, hang on a moment, structurally, systemically, we've got the same thing happening again and again and again and again, right? There's nobody actually in the Australian regulatory system that's doing that. So no root cause analysis, no understanding of why these things are actually happening again and again. And that's the bit of the puzzle that for me is the most damning of all.
Well, and as we discussed recently, that's born out of self-regulation. We all embraced this in the 80s as part of the neoliberal reforms. There's two types of regulation that the banks are under in Australia. One is APRA's capital requirements, so that they get told what to do on that front, but there's ways to fudge the books, as we know, in that regard. And the other one is a voluntary banking code of conduct that's not enforced by an external authority. It's voluntary and it's unenforceable. And whenever there's been a move to try and make it enforceable, the banks have screamed and jumped up and down. And AFCA started off as the Financial Ombudsman Service, funded by the banks, and it's still the industry-funded model. These people are not going to regulate themselves. They're not. They call it self-regulation. That means no regulation, right? And they do not want to change that. And the impotence of the politicians is what is the cause of this problem. They have signed onto this. So some of it is fear. Some of it is 30 years of brainwashing, frankly. Many politicians on the Labor side are just as ideological as the politicians on the Liberal side. Now, neoliberalism is waning because we've had 40 years of it and the jury is in, right? The verdict is clear. It's a failure. That our economy is not better off than it was 40 years ago. By any measure, it's not better off. I don't care if you've got a flat screen TV and a Netflix account. That's not what makes an economy work, right? It's failed, but the politicians who got their basic, economics degree at university, right? They believe that it's fine. It's very hard for them to think outside of this. So it's the public that has to impose on the politician, look, this is a failed system and you've got to change. And that's got to come through public pressure. And so my message to everyone here, I really encourage people, share this with all financial victims you know. There's an army of financial victims out there who've given up. They're in limbo. They some of them may have heard about the compensation scheme of last resort and think, well, maybe that'll throw us a bone or something. My message to you is if they are not going to compensate these victims, the Sterling victims, they're not going to compensate anybody. And Martin, on the comments last week, some people were asking, well, please explain what the Sterling case was. So we don't want to take for granted that people know that, but just very, very briefly, this was a rent for life scheme that started in Western Australia. It was spruiked by celebrities like the cricketer Mitchell Johnson, right, who was just then with his moustache and, beating England in the Ashes and all that kind of stuff, and because Mitchell's a Western Australian. It was spruiked by those sort of people. And these consumers were told, you can downsize, you're living in a house, you can sell your house, downsize to live in a smaller house because you're elderly, your house is getting too big or whatever, downsize, live in a smaller house, and give us a lump sum, and that'll pay your rent for the rest of your life, or 40 years. But of course, for the age group, that's, it would be one person may get beyond the 40 years. You'll pay for the rest of your life. And that's what they did. And it was an attractive proposition. And so they signed up for that. None of them at any stage thought they were doing more than signing residential tenancy agreements. That's all they thought they were doing. And none of them also had any clue that the person they were signing up with was a multiply failed financial director with a string of failures in his wake and thousands of victims who've lost lots of money. They didn't know that. And those of them who did more due diligence than others and went to ASIC and said, we've got this offer, anything you can tell us about it, anything we should be concerned about, any red flags, they were assured, no, there's no red flags. The scheme started in 2015, and the documents that ASIC was forced to hand over to the inquiry last year that we got up showed that from the first year this scheme was in place, ASIC knew that the principal of the scheme, not the person who applied for the financial license, but the principal of the scheme was this multiple failed director, Ray Jones. The person who applied for the financial license for this scheme was his son, Ryan Jones. ASIC knew that as well, who his father was. In the first year, when only about $400,000 had been paid in by a few victims, ASIC received 3 complaints. And they were internal complaints, 1 external complaint and 2 internal complaints. People inside ASIC said, this is the way this is presented, everything about this is looking dodgy. And ASIC consistently marked those complaints, no further action, no further action, no further action. In 2017, early in 2017, they got a complaint from when $6 million had been paid in, they got a complaint from the Western Australian government itself that said there's something wrong here. And even then it took 6 months for ASIC to start acting on that complaint. And by the time that process unfolded, ASIC, and eventually the pressure built up and ASIC finally did start taking action in 2018, and the scheme came to an end in 2019, there were 130 people who paid in a total of $18 million, right? And one of the excuses, I think I mentioned this last week, one of the excuses that Joe Longo, the chairman of ASIC, came up with at the inquiry last year was, even though they knew they had all these internal complaints about Sterling First, he said, yeah, but none of the victims were complaining. And that's because they didn't know they were in a scheme, but ASIC did. All they thought, they'd handed over their money and they're living in their houses. They were happy, right? Meanwhile, ASIC knew they were in a scheme. And in fact, ASIC knew so well that in 2017, it sent people around to knock on their doors and say, oh, hi, I'm from ASIC. I just wanted, is everything okay? You're happy with the arrangement? Didn't tell them why they were suspiciously doing that, just casual. And of course, all these tenants, they're thinking, yeah, I've paid my tenancy, I've paid up front, I signed all the residential tenancy agreement contracts. I'm happy. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mr. ASIC. Of course, they're elderly people and they're slightly curious about this, had no clue about the significance of it, but it all comes flooding back to them in 2019 when the scheme finally collapses. And that's why. There's not as many, there's lots of financial collapses out there, but this one is so transparently ASIC's liability, it's not funny. And that's why I said, if they're not going to compensate these people, you can have no confidence they're going to compensate anybody. So we need people to rally around these victims. If we can get a precedent set for these victims, we can force the government and the opposition to take up the bigger issue of ASIC. They've got to compensate those victims because that is them saying, yes, we accept ASIC stuffed up. And the minute they accept that, then they've got to commit to cleaning up ASIC. And the precedent that we want them to set, that they don't want to set, is the precedent that's going to get justice for you eventually as a financial victim. Right? That's the issue. They could do it. They just, they're too captured to want to do it at the moment. So the public has to force them to change their mind.
And the point here, Robbie, is that very often investors won't know there's a problem until the whole company collapses, right? Which can be many years down the track, because these things have a habit of just going on a bit, on a bit, on a bit. And quite often, it's quite clear that there are people who know that there are problems, but nothing is ever done until it's way too late. And that's the fundamental philosophical shift we need to make our watchdog be a watchdog. In other words, as soon as there's actually evidence and concern, then action is taken, and action is taken forcibly, and action is taken with the interests of those individual investors at the center of it. Whereas today, option one is to do nothing, because that is easy. Option two, they protect their own interests, ASIC's interests, because they don't want to be seen to be actually, messing up. Option three, and they've got to think about the financial system, et cetera, et cetera. And right at the bottom, last person at the bottom of the pile are those investors, the very investors who've been persuaded through the superannuation system and persuaded by, the broader philosophy of the financialization of everything. You have to invest to survive, and yet the regulatory frameworks, the regulatory systems are not there to protect, support, and enable the investors to be confident in the decisions they've taken. That's the heart of the issue. That's why you've got to ask your politicians and your political candidates about this. This is a big deal.
Yeah, go hard on them, people. If you want more information, you can get onto our website, citizensparty.org.au, or call in on our toll-free number, 1-800-636-432. We're going to put out a statement tomorrow, which includes some of what I read earlier on AFCA and what was handed out at the Sterling event. But we need to reach out to all the financial victims out there and get them rallying behind these victims, these Sterling victims. And we need to get everybody to start confronting candidates on this issue. And what you'll find, of course, is the minor party candidates will readily commit. Many of the major party candidates, the backbencher types, will actually take you seriously. You'll be educating them by challenging them. They'll be interested to know. It's only when they get in there that they'll be read the rules. And the rules are, you don't touch this, you don't touch that, you don't talk about this, you don't talk about that. But if enough are in touch with the grassroots feeling out there, then it'll be harder for the powers that be in their parties to enforce those rules. So this engagement with politicians and candidates now is incredibly important. But we want all the financial victims to rally around these Sterling victims and target Labor especially, including Stephen Jones. And feel free to call Stephen Jones. In fact, we'll provide his number at the bottom of this video. Call Stephen Jones and start demanding that he commit to compensating the Sterling victims and cleaning up ASIC, right? At a certain point, he'll get the picture. Stephen Jones was the person back in 2019, Martin, when we fought the cash ban, as you remember. The first politician to actually, in the major parties, to actually comment on it was Stephen Jones, because it's part of his responsibility. He said Labor would support it, and that was in August 2019. And that should have been the end of it, because if Labor decides to support something that the Liberals have put up, then there's no way, you don't have the numbers to stop it. But that was not the end of it, because we rallied, we mobilised, we expanded that campaign so massively that within a few months, Jones has got the picture and he'd agreed to an inquiry. The inquiry exposed there was no evidence. Everyone's scurrying for the exit. No one wanted to be seen to be holding the bag of this stupid policy that would have banned cash transactions over 10 grand. And by the end of the next year, the bill had been dropped out of Parliament completely. We well and truly defeated that. And that meant forcing Stephen Jones to turn around. So we did that then, and we can do it again, but this time the stakes are much, much bigger. This is the entire functionality of our financial system, and whether you can have any confidence as an investor going forward.
Yeah, and I want to make just one final point before we close. The neoliberal philosophy, which is underpinning what policies have been driven in the last 40 years or so, is absolutely embedded in the public service in Australia as well. So the Treasury and all of those other hangers-on, they all are indoctrinated with this same neoliberal view, which is free markets, don't interfere too much, et cetera, right? So the other angle here is to really question that, right? So There is a critical role for government in the protection of its citizens and in the appropriate regulation of the way that the financial system and other systems in the country go. Just saying, leave it to the free markets is not acceptable. It's failed. It's failed over the last 40 years, unless you're in the 1% who've done extremely well, thank you, because over the last 40 years, the one thing you can observe is that a small number of people have got extremely rich at the expense of everybody else, right? We need a different approach in Australia and around the world, right, which is not neoliberal based.
Yeah.
And so the other angle is actually to understand that there is a set of assumptions about the way that the country works and the economy works, which you have to question.
Hear, hear. And you got to look, let's peel back the layers of the onion. We've got this one half peeled. But yeah, the whole thing, I can talk for hours about that, what you just said, Martin, but we probably shouldn't.
No, I think this is probably enough for today. But I just wanted to make that contextual point, right? Because but quite a lot of what I see is that we're sort of dealing with symptoms, right? And this ASIC is a great example of the symptom of the problem. But it's the neoliberal philosophy, which is the underlying problem, which we've got to actually change.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's like it wasn't the antler or the deer in the jungle that came up with survival of the fittest. It was the lion. That's the problem with these philosophies, right? They got taught them at school and brainwashed into them, but they were never. It was a thin veneer for a self-serving scam to benefit that 1%, and that's what. 40 years later, if you can't see through it, we'll put glasses on like I have to now and try to have another look, because it's pretty clear. But then you identify, the specific problems, and you make sure you change it one problem at a time if you have to, but you've got to change it. And this question of the financial system, protection of consumers, is all important.
Absolutely. Robbie, thanks for your time today. We'll get the show up and put the links and things below. And we'll keep preaching the gospel, eh?
Yep. Thanks very much.
See you later. Take care.